Welcome to Blind History with Josh Berry. Over the next few weeks, we will be diving into the history of Egypt. Here is the full article. Second Intermediate Period in New Kingdom, circa 1650 through 1069 BCE, a new fragmentation, the Second Intermediate Period. After the relative stability and cultural refinement of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt entered another era of political fragmentation known as the Second Intermediate Period. Central authority weakened, and once again different regions of the Nile Valley fall under competing rulers. This time, however, a new element altered the balance. Foreign dynasties established themselves on Egyptian soil, most famously the Hyksos in the eastern Delta. The factors leading to this breakdown were complex. The later Middle Kingdom saw a rapid turnover of kings, suggesting succession problems or factional struggles at court. Over time, local officials and military commanders gained more autonomy, and foreign groups, especially from Western Asia, settled in the eastern Delta in growing numbers. These migrants took part in agriculture, trade, and military service, gradually forming communities with their own leaders and internal cohesion. As central control from Memphis and Thebes eroded, one of these foreign-based groups consolidated power in the Delta, establishing a line of rulers later called the Hyksos. Meanwhile, native Egyptian dynasties survived in the south, particularly around Thebes, and possibly in other pockets. Egypt was no longer a unified kingdom under a single pharaoh, but a patchwork of overlapping claims and shifting alliances. The Hyksos and their rule in Egypt. The Hyksos, likely a confederation of peoples from the Levant and surrounding regions, adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture while maintaining their own traditions. They ruled from a capital in the northeastern Delta and controlled much of Lower Egypt, including valuable trade routes with the Levant and Sinai. Their exact origins and ethnic composition remain debated, but they introduced or popularized certain military and technological innovations in Egypt, such as the horse-drawn chariot and improved forms of bronze weaponry. Rather than simply plundering Egypt, the Hyksos established themselves as kings in the Egyptian sense, using royal titulary, worshipping Egyptian gods alongside their own, and participating in the bureaucratic and religious systems of the land. Their monuments and inscriptions show a blending of cultural elements, Egyptian iconography and language infused with Levantine names and motifs. For Egyptians living under Hyksos rule, daily life probably combined continuity with change. Farming, local cults, and village structures continued, but elites, foreign officials, and different military practices altered the social landscape. Trade with Western Asia may have increased, bringing in new goods and opportunities, but also exposing Egypt to greater external influences and pressures. The Theban resistance in the War of Liberation in Upper Egypt. Thebes emerged once more as a center of native resistance and revival. A local dynasty there traced its authority back to earlier Middle Kingdom kings and presented itself as the legitimate guardian of Egyptian tradition. Tensions between the Theban rulers and the Hyksos intensified over time, fueled by competition for territory, trade, and ideological supremacy. Accounts preserved in later periods describe a series of conflicts and provocations that led to open war. The Theban kings gradually pushed northward, forging alliances, mobilizing troops, and adopting some of the new military technologies that the Hyksos had brought, such as chariots and composite bows. Warfare now involved more mobile units and more sophisticated tactics than earlier in Egyptian history. Through successive campaigns, Theban rulers eroded Hyksos control and eventually besieged and captured their Delta strongholds. The climax of the struggle, traditionally credited to a king who would be remembered as the founder of the 18th dynasty, marked the end of Hyksos rule and the formal reunification of Egypt. This victory became foundational for the ideology of the new kingdom. Egypt had thrown off foreign domination and reasserted its destiny as a unified, powerful state. The new kingdom, an imperial Egypt, with the establishment of the 18th dynasty, Egypt entered the new kingdom, a period often considered the height of its power and international influence. The trauma of foreign rule left a deep imprint on the new rulers. Determined to prevent a repeat of the Hyksos episode, they pursued a more aggressive foreign policy, pushing Egypt's frontiers outward rather than relying on natural borders alone. In the south, Egypt extended its control deep into Nubia, incorporating it as a province and exploiting its gold mines and trade routes. Fortresses and temple towns linked the Nile corridor, and Nubian elites participated in Egyptian culture, serving in the army and administration. In the northeast, New Kingdom kings campaigned into the Levant, securing vassal states, tribute, and strategic footholds against rival powers like Mitanni and later the Hittites. Egypt in the New Kingdom became a true empire, with foreign tribute, diplomatic marriages, and far-flung military campaigns all feeding into its economy and ideology. The pharaoh was no longer just king of the two lands, he was also a great conqueror and international statesman, dealing with other great kings on relatively equal terms in letters and treaties. The reign of powerful warrior kings, early New Kingdom rulers capitalized on the momentum created by the expulsion of the Hyksos. Kings like Thutmose I, Thutmose III, and others led numerous campaigns into Nubia and the Levant, leaving inscriptions and reliefs that celebrated their victories and the wealth they brought back to Egypt. These kings often portrayed themselves in the traditional pose of smiting enemies, but they also recorded more detailed accounts of battles, sieges, and diplomatic arrangements. Thutmose III in particular became famous for his military skill and the breadth of his campaigns. He and his generals conducted multiple expeditions into Syria-Palestine, capturing strategic cities, subduing rebellious vassals, and securing Egypt's position in a competitive international system. The tribute and booty from these campaigns filled royal treasuries, supported temple endowments, and allowed the king to reward loyal officials. At the same time, the New Kingdom army itself evolved into a more professional force with divisions, foreign contingents, and specialized units such as charioteers. Military service could offer a path to advancement for commoners and foreigners alike, further intertwining Egypt's internal society with its imperial ventures. The transformation of Thebes and the rise of Amun. Thebes, which had been the heart of resistance during the Second Intermediate period, now became the religious and, to a large extent, ideological capital of the New Kingdom. The god Amun, elevated by the Theban dynasties, merged with the sun god as Amun-Ra and rose to the apex of the Egyptian pantheon. His main temple at Karnak expanded into a vast complex of halls, pylons, obelisks, and sacred precincts. New Kingdom pharaohs poured resources into Amun's cult, crediting him with their military victories and political legitimacy. They presented themselves as chosen by Amun, sometimes depicting the god fathering them in symbolic scenes that emphasized their divine right to rule. Huge donations of land, goods, and labor to the temple of Amun and his priesthood made the religious establishment extremely powerful and wealthy. The city of Thebes itself was reshaped by royal patronage. Temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, linked by processional routes, provided the stage for elaborate festivals, such as the Opat festival, in which the god's statue traveled between temples, reaffirming the bond between God, king, and people. For Thebans and many Egyptians, these rituals dramatized the harmony between divine will and royal action. Hatshepsut and the question of female kingship. One of the most remarkable figures of the New Kingdom was Hatshepsut, a royal woman who stepped beyond the usual roles of queen and regent to rule as king in her own right. Initially acting as regent for a young male heir, she gradually adopted full royal titulary and iconographic, presenting herself in male kingly form in many reliefs and statues, while also emphasizing her special status in divine selection. Hatshepsut's reign focused heavily on building and trade rather than warfare. She commissioned magnificent monuments, including her terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which integrated architecture, relief, sculpture, and landscape in a striking way. She also sent expeditions to Punt, a region likely in the Red Sea area, bringing back exotic goods such as incense, myrrh trees, and rare animals. Her reign demonstrated that Egypt's political system could, under certain conditions, accommodate a female king, though later tradition often tried to minimize or reinterpret her role. After her death, some of her monuments and names were altered or defaced, possibly as part of a political effort by her successors to solidify their own legitimacy and reassert a more conventional male kingship. Akhenaten and the Religious Revolution. Another extraordinary episode in the New Kingdom was the reign of Akhenaten, a king who initiated a radical religious and artistic transformation. Breaking with the traditional dominance of Amun and other gods, he elevated the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, as the supreme and, in many texts, the only god worthy of worship. He changed his own name to reflect devotion to the Aten and moved the capital to a new city dedicated to this deity. Art under Akhenaten's rule departed from long-established conventions. Royal figures were depicted with elongated heads, narrow chests, and rounded bellies, sometimes in intimate family scenes with the Aten's rays reaching down to bless them. Temples to the Aten were open air, emphasizing the sun's light rather than enclosed sanctuaries. The new theology presented the king and his family as the sole intermediaries between the Aten and humanity. This experiment, however, proved short-lived. After Akhenaten's death, his religious reforms were rapidly reversed. Traditional gods were restored, the capital returned to earlier centers, and later rulers often treated Akhenaten's reign as a heresy to be erased. Yet the episode reveals how flexible, at least briefly, Egyptian religion could be, and how deeply intertwined theological shifts were with political and social tensions. Tutankhamun and the Restoration. The young king Tutankhamun, whose tomb would become famous in modern times for its rich, largely intact contents, played a symbolic role in the restoration of traditional religion after Akhenaten.
During his short reign, advisors and priests guided a return to the old gods, especially Amun, and promoted decrees that re-established temples, festivals, and priestly offices damaged or neglected during the Aten-focused years.
Although Tutankhamun himself died young and did not achieve major political or military feats, his reign represented a healing phase in Egyptian society. The state sought to repair relationships with powerful priesthoods, restore economic flows to temples, and reassure the population that the divine order had been set right again. Later rulers would capitalize on this sense of restoration to present themselves as rightful heirs and defenders of the ancestral religion.
Ramesses II in the era of great monuments. In the 19th dynasty, Egypt produced another of its most famous kings, Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great.
His long reign was marked by ambitious building projects, extensive military campaigns, and a deliberate effort to project an image of unparalleled greatness.
He erected temples and statues across Egypt and Nubia, inscribing his name so frequently that he became one of the most recognizable pharaohs in the archaeological record.
Militarily, Ramesses II is particularly associated with the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, one of the best documented battles of the ancient Near East. Though the engagement was tactically indecisive, both sides later claimed victory. The eventual outcome was a peace treaty and diplomatic marriage arrangements, marking a new phase of international diplomacy in which Egypt and the Hittites recognized each other as great powers and strategic partners. Ramesses II's building program included colossal statues, temple complexes such as the Ramesseum in Thebes, and rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in Nubia. These monuments not only glorified the king, but also reinforced key themes of New Kingdom ideology. The king as mighty warrior, pious devotee of the gods, and guarantor of Egypt's prosperity and security. Society, economy, and daily life in the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom's imperial reach and monumental culture rested on the labor of a complex society. Farmers in the Nile Valley produced surplus food that supported royal courts, temples, craftsmen, soldiers, and administrators. State and temple estates owned large tracts of land, employing workers and overseers to manage agricultural production and animal husbandry. Artisan communities, such as the one at Deir el-Medina near Thebes, illustrate the lives of specialized workers who created royal tombs and other high-status objects. These artisans enjoyed relatively privileged conditions, receiving rations from the state and living in planned villages. Yet they also voiced grievances, went on strike when supplies were delayed, and left behind personal letters and graffiti that revealed their everyday concerns, humor, and piety. The New Kingdom also saw a significant presence of foreigners within Egypt's borders, prisoners of war, mercenaries, traders, and migrants who settled and sometimes rose to important positions. Egyptian society became more ethnically and culturally varied, even as official ideology continued to present Egypt as a distinct superior civilization at the center of the world. Religion, temples, and the afterlife in the New Kingdom. Religion in the New Kingdom was both grand and intimate. At the grand level, enormous temples to gods like Amun, Ra, Pat, and others dominated the landscape. These institutions functioned as economic hubs, employing priests, scribes, farmers, and craftsmen, and controlling vast resources. Daily rituals, seasonal festivals, and oracles at temple sites tied communities to their gods and to the state. At the intimate level, individuals and families continued to cultivate personal relationships with gods and deceased relatives. Stelae, letters to the dead, and small votive offerings attest to the belief that gods and ancestors could intervene in daily problems, health, fertility, legal disputes, and emotional distress. The idea that the heart of the deceased would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the afterlife emphasized personal moral responsibility, not just ritual observance. Funerary practices in the New Kingdom reached a high degree of elaboration. Mummification became more standardized, and tombs, especially those in the Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens near Thebes, were decorated with detailed scenes and texts from the so-called Books of the Dead and other compositions. These works mapped the underworld, named its dangers, and promised rewards for those who had lived rightly and received proper burial rites. Decline in the end of the New Kingdom. Despite its achievements, the New Kingdom could not maintain its peak forever. Over time, several pressures eroded its stability. The cost of empire, maintaining garrisons, conducting campaigns, and administering far-flung territories, strained resources. Rival powers in the Near East, shifts in trade routes, and waves of migrants and raiders altered the geopolitical landscape. Internally, the increasing wealth and independence of powerful priesthoods, especially that of Amun at Thebes, challenged royal authority. Some kings struggled to balance the demands of temple institutions with the need to fund the state and the army. Succession disputes, short reigns, and court rivalries further weakened central control. By the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt's hold on its Asiatic possessions had largely evaporated, and its control of Nubia had weakened. The country faced attacks from groups often referred to as sea peoples and other external threats. Although Egypt repelled some invasions, the cumulative effect of external pressures and internal fragmentation led to the collapse of New Kingdom unity and the onset of a new era of divided rule and foreign influence. The legacy of the Second Intermediate Period and New Kingdom. The Second Intermediate Period and New Kingdom together form a dramatic chapter in Egypt's history, from foreign domination and internal fracture to imperial expansion, cultural brilliance, and then gradual decline. The memory of expelling the Hyksos and the creation of an empire shaped Egyptian self-understanding for centuries. New Kingdom monuments, texts, and artistic conventions became touchstones for later periods and for modern perceptions of pharaonic Egypt. In your broader project, this section marks the high tide of ancient Egyptian power and international engagement. The state, having survived multiple collapses and refoundings, now played a decisive role in a wider world of empires and rival kingdoms. At the same time, the social and religious complexity of New Kingdom Egypt, its diverse population, powerful temples, and rich theological traditions set the stage for the challenges and transformations that would follow under Libyan Kushite. Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman rule. Section 4, Expanded Second Intermediate Period in New Kingdom c. 1650-1069 BCE, the Second Intermediate Period in perspective. The Second Intermediate Period sits between two high points, the cultural refinement of the Middle Kingdom and the imperial power of the New Kingdom. It was a time of fragmented authority, foreign rule in parts of Egypt, and significant social and technological change. Yet, like the First Intermediate Period, it was not simply an age of collapse. It was also a period of adaptation that laid important foundations for what came next.
Whereas the First Intermediate Period primarily involved competition among Egyptian dynasties and provincial elites, the Second Intermediate Period introduced foreign dynasties ruling Egyptian territory, most notably the Hyksos in the eastern Delta. This added a new dimension to Egyptian politics. Internal divisions now intersected with the presence of powerful non-Egyptian elites who adopted some Egyptian forms while retaining their own identities and conditions abroad.
Understanding this era helps explain why the New Kingdom pharaohs were so determined to push Egypt's frontiers outward. The memory of foreign rulers in the Delta haunted their imagination and shaped their aggressive foreign policy, turning Egypt from a primarily river-based kingdom into a land-based empire. Political patchwork. Multiple dynasties, one Nile. During the Second Intermediate Period, Egypt was not divided neatly into just two rival kingdoms. Instead, several dynasties ruled overlapping regions at different times. Scholars assign the numbers of 13 through 17 dynasties, but contemporary Egyptians would have experienced them more as local powers, each claiming some form of royal legitimacy. Broadly speaking, three main power centers can be identified. Hyksos rulers in the eastern Delta, often associated with the 15th dynasty, governing from a stronghold in the northeast and controlling much of Lower Egypt. Native Egyptian dynasties in Upper Egypt, particularly at Thebes, where rulers 16th and 17th dynasties maintained Egyptian traditions and increasingly cast themselves as champions of national restoration. Other local rulers, smaller dynasties, or city-based elites who controlled pockets of territory, sometimes aligning with one major power or another. These entities interacted in complex ways, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, sometimes coexisting in uneasy truce. The Nile remained the main artery binding the land together, but its length was now dotted with different authorities, each levying taxes, recruiting soldiers, and sponsoring temples in its domain. Origins and character of the Hyksos. The Hyksos, whose name in Egyptian sources is usually understood as rulers of foreign lands, were not a single tribe but a mix of Western Asiatic groups who had gradually settled in the eastern Delta over generations. Initially, many came as traders, herders, and mercenaries working within the Egyptian system. As central authority weakened during the late Middle Kingdom and 13th dynasty, these communities consolidated, elected or accepted their own leaders, and eventually took control of key Delta cities. Culturally, the Hyksos blended Levantine and Egyptian elements. Their names, some deities, and certain customs betray origins in regions corresponding broadly to modern Syria, Palestine. At the same time, they adopted the Egyptian world titulary, used hieroglyphic inscriptions, and presented themselves as pharaohs when addressing Egyptian subjects. Their temples included both Levantine and Egyptian gods. Their administration employed Egyptian scribes alongside foreign officials. This mix made them both familiar and alien to Egyptians. For many local inhabitants of the Delta, life likely continued with some continuity. Fields were tilled, taxes paid, and local cults maintained. But the presence of foreign rulers, foreign troops, and new military technologies was a constant reminder that the old order had been disrupted. Military technologies and innovations. One of the most enduring legacies often attributed to the Hyksos is the introduction or widespread adoption of new military technologies in Egypt. Two stand out in particular: horse-drawn chariot. While horses and chariots existed elsewhere in the Near East before the Hyksos, their appearance in Egypt is closely associated with this period. Chariots drawn by teams of horses provided a fast, mobile platform for archers, revolutionizing battlefield tactics. Improved bows and weapons. Composite bows made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew offered greater range and power than simple wooden bows. New forms of bronze weapons, daggers, axes, spearheads, also enhanced the fighting capabilities of those who possessed them. The Hyksos' use of these technologies gave them a significant advantage over enemies who relied on older methods of warfare. Over time, however, native Egyptian forces learned to adopt and adapt these innovations. By the time of the New Kingdom, chariots and composite bows had become integral to Egyptian military doctrine, turning an initial vulnerability into a core strength. Theban theocracy and the rise of Amun in Upper Egypt. Thebes emerged as the main center of native Egyptian resistance during the Second Intermediate period. The Theban rulers claimed descent from earlier Middle Kingdom dynasties and anchored their legitimacy in the cult of Amun, a local god whose importance grew steadily over time. Amun, originally a relatively modest deity, became increasingly associated with kingship and national identity. As Theban power expanded, so did the prestige of Amun's priesthood. Temples dedicated to him received donations, land, and labor, while rituals emphasized his role as a god who chose and supported rightful kings. In later centuries, Amun would be fused with the sun god Ra, as Amon-Ra, becoming the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon. During the Second Intermediate period, this theocratic partnership between Theban rulers and Amun's priesthood laid the ideological groundwork for the New Kingdom. When Theban kings finally defeated the Hyksos and reunited Egypt, they credited Amun with guiding their victories, and they rewarded his temples with wealth and political influence that would shape the next several hundred years. The War of Liberation. From local conflict to national myth, the conflict between Thebes and the Hyksos gradually escalated from border skirmishes into a full-scale war of liberation. Later narratives, though often stylized, tell of provocative incidents and declarations of war that galvanized Theban rulers and their supporters. The campaigns likely spanned several reigns, including those of kings whose names are remembered as early heroes of the 18th dynasty's founding. The war unfolded along the Nile corridor, with Theban forces pushing northward, capturing strongholds and trying to cut Hyksos lines of communication and supply. The Hyksos, in turn, would have mobilized their own troops, including charioteers and foreign allies, to resist. Cities were besieged and fortifications tested, in a struggle that combined conventional battles with attrition and diplomacy. Eventually, Theban kings succeeded in capturing the main Hyksos capital, expelling the dynasty from Egypt proper. In Egyptian memory, this victory became a foundational myth. Egyptians had thrown off foreign rule and restored the purity of pharaonic sovereignty. The trauma of foreign domination and the triumph of liberation would echo through New Kingdom ideology, reinforcing xenophobic currents and justifying an assertive foreign policy. The birth of the New Kingdom, reunification and renewal. With the defeat of the Hyksos and the subjugation or integration of other regional powers, a new era began, the New Kingdom. The 18th dynasty, founded by Theban rulers, now governed a reunified Egypt that had gained both scars and new tools from the Second Intermediate period. This new state was consciously more militarized and outward-looking than many earlier periods. The kings recognized that simply maintaining Egypt's traditional borders was not enough to prevent future invasions from the north and northeast. Instead, they adopted a strategy of forward defense, controlling strategic territories in Nubia and the Levant so that potential enemies would have to confront Egyptian forces far from the Nile Valley. At the same time, the New Kingdom rulers embarked on ambitious building programs, especially in Thebes, to celebrate their victories and honor the gods who had assisted them. Temples to Amun and other deities expanded dramatically, and new festivals and rituals commemorated the restoration of Ma'at after the time of foreigners. Early 18th dynasty, consolation and campaigns. The early New Kingdom kings had three main tasks: consolidate internal authority, reform and equip the army, and establish Egypt's position in the wider Near Eastern political landscape. They moved quickly on all fronts. Internally, they reasserted control over the nomes, replaced or co-opted local elites, and reorganized taxation to channel resources to the crown and temples. The administrative apparatus, drawing on Middle Kingdom traditions, was strengthened and adapted to the new realities of empire. Scribes, officials, and priests formed the backbone of a state that needed both efficiency and ideological cohesion. Militarily, the army was re-equipped with chariots, composite bows, and other advanced weapons learned from the Hyksos and Near Eastern practice. Professional soldiers, including foreign mercenaries and specialized units, were integrated into a command structure that could conduct extended campaigns beyond Egypt's borders. The kings themselves led, or at least ceremonially presided over these campaigns, presenting themselves as warrior pharaohs defending and expanding Egypt's sphere. Abroad, the early 18th dynasty kings launched campaigns south into Nubia, securing gold mines and trade routes, and north into the Levant, where they confronted local city-states and larger powers. These expeditions were not one-off raids. They established a pattern of regular campaigning, tribute collection, and diplomatic engagement that would define New Kingdom foreign policy. Empire in Nubia, forts, temples, and cultural exchange in Nubia, south of Egypt's traditional border, the New Kingdom established a more direct and integrated rule than ever before. Forts and administrative centers lined the Nile, and Egyptian officials governed the region as a colony or province. Egyptian temples, dedicated to gods like Amun and local Nubian deities, were constructed, serving as both religious and political outposts. Gold extraction was a primary motive for this deep penetration into Nubia. New Kingdom texts proudly record the quantities of gold brought back from the south, which funded building projects, military campaigns, and royal largesse. Nubian labor and soldiers also contributed to Egypt's manpower pool, with Nubians serving in the Egyptian army and even rising to positions of command. Culturally, the relationship was not one way. Nubian elites adopted Egyptian language, art, and religion to varying degrees while retaining their own traditions. Over time, this created a hybrid culture in Nubia that was deeply familiar with Egyptian models, a fact that would become crucial centuries later when Nubian kings from Kush would rule Egypt itself. Empire in the Levant, Thutmose III in the international system. To the northeast, New Kingdom Egypt became a major player in the international system of the Late Bronze Age. City-states in Syria, Palestine, caught between Egypt, the Hittites, and other powers, navigated a delicate balance of vassalage, alliance, and resistance. New Kingdom pharaohs sought to secure these territories as buffer zones and sources of tribute. Thutmose III is often highlighted as a key architect of Egyptian imperialism in the Levant. Over the course of numerous campaigns, he subdued rebellious cities, defeated coalitions of local rulers, and established Egyptian dominance over vital trade routes. Battle accounts, including the famous campaign at Megiddo, portray him as a bold and strategic commander. Under his rule and that of successors, Egyptian garrisons, administrators, and local client kings maintained a network of control. Tribute and taxes flowed to Egypt, bringing exotic goods, raw materials, and wealth that funded temples and palaces. Egyptian art from this period often depicts foreign tribute bearers bringing offerings, visually reinforcing the idea of Egypt at the center of a world of subject peoples. At the same time, this imperial system required constant attention. Revolts, shifting alliances, and the ambitions of rival great powers meant that New Kingdom kings could not neglect their northern frontier. The cost, human, financial, and political, of maintaining this empire would eventually strain Egypt's resources. The height of Thebes, temples and festivals. While Memphis and other cities remained important, Thebes became the religious heart of the New Kingdom. The Temple of Amun at Karnak expanded into a vast complex, with successive kings adding pylons, courts, obelisks, and sanctuaries. Nearby, the temple at Luxor, linked to Karnak by a processional avenue, played a key role in festivals that showcased the connection between god and king. One of the most important of these was the Opet festival. During this celebration, the statue of Amun was carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor, accompanied by priests, musicians, dancers, and crowds of worshippers. The king participated in rituals that symbolically renewed his kingship and reaffirmed his relationship with Amun. Such festivals integrated religious experience with royal propaganda, reinforcing loyalty and a shared sense of cosmic order. On the west bank of Thebes, across the Nile, a string of royal mortuary temples, often called mansions of millions of years, lined the desert edge. These complexes, associated with individual pharaohs, served as sites where the king's cult would be maintained after death and where offerings would be made to sustain his spirit. The temples were decorated with scenes of battle, offering, and divine interaction, creating a visual narrative of each king's achievements. Hatshepsut in depth, gender, power, and architecture. Hatshepsut's reign deserves more detailed attention because it reveals both the flexibility and the limits of Egyptian royal ideology. As a royal woman who took on full kingly status, she challenged conventional norms but did so using existing symbolic tools rather than inventing a new system. Initially acting as regent for her young stepson and nephew, she gradually claimed the full titles of a king. In reliefs and statues, she is often shown in male dress, with the traditional false beard, yet inscriptions still sometimes acknowledge her female identity. She commissioned texts that emphasized her divine birth from Amun, presenting her rule as destined and sanctioned by the highest god. Her foreign policy, to the extent we can reconstruct it, was relatively cautious compared to some male counterparts. The famous expedition to Pont celebrated in reliefs at her mortuary temple at Delta.The highlights trade and diplomacy rather than conquest. Hunt represented both a source of exotic goods and a place of mythic resonance, and the expedition symbolically linked her reign to prosperity and cosmic favor. Architecturally, her Delta.The temple is a masterpiece of integration with the natural landscape. Terrace colonnades, ramps, and courtyards rise against the cliffs, creating a dramatic backdrop for rituals honoring both Hatshepsut and the gods. The temple's reliefs narrate key events of her reign and underscore themes of legitimacy, piety, and abundance. Akhenaten's religious revolution in detail. Akhenaten's reign marks one of the most radical experiments in pharaonic history. Breaking with centuries of tradition, he elevated the Aten, the visible sun disk, as the supreme or even sole god, eclipsing Amun and most other deities. He changed his name from Amenhotep Amun to satisfy to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, signaling a profound shift in allegiance. He moved the royal court to a new capital, often called Akhetaten, modern Amarna, built in Middle Egypt on a previously undeveloped site. The city's layout, with sunlit courtyards and open-air temples, embodied the Aten's emphasis on light and visibility. Temples to the Aten lacked the dark and closed sanctuaries typical of older cults. Instead, altars and offering tables stood under the open sky, bathed in sunlight. Art under Akhenaten departed from established conventions. The royal family is shown in unusually intimate scenes, playing with children, embracing, and worshipping under the Aten's rays, which end in small hands offering life to the king and queen. Bodies are rendered with elongated skulls, narrow chests, and rounded bellies, a style that has provoked much discussion. Whether symbolic, physiological, or both, the style reinforced the uniqueness of this religious moment. However, Akhenaten's reforms provoked resistance. By sidelining Amun and other powerful gods, he attacked the economic and political foundations of major priesthoods, especially in Thebes. His focus on the Aten and the royal family as the only legitimate intermediaries may have alienated many Egyptians, who relied on traditional gods and local cults for comfort and protection. After his death, a rapid and deliberate restoration of the old religion took place. The Aten cult was dismantled, the capital abandoned, and Akhenaten's memory often treated as an error or heresy. Statues and inscriptions were defaced, and later kings presented themselves as restorers of Na'at. This reaction underscores both the depth of his challenge and the resilience of traditional Egyptian religion. Tutankhamun, I, and Horemheb, cleaning up after Amarna. The short reign of Tutankhamun, guided by powerful courtiers and priests, was devoted largely to undoing Akhenaten's religious policies. The young king, initially named Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun to reflect renewed devotion to Amun. Decrees proclaimed the restoration of temples, priesthoods, and festivals. The memory of the Aten's exclusive dominance was suppressed in official rhetoric, even as some of its artistic echoes lingered. Tutankhamun's early death without surviving heirs led to a rapid succession of rulers, including I, a senior official who became king, and Horemheb, a military commander. Horemheb in particular set about restructuring the state, purging corrupt officials and reorganizing administration. He presented himself as a restorer who had corrected the abuses of previous reigns, including the perceived excesses of Akhenaten's revolution. Horemheb's reforms laid the groundwork for the 19th dynasty. By appointing capable administrators, revising legal and fiscal systems, and reaffirming traditional religious structures, he attempted to stabilize the kingdom and reassert royal authority after years of theological experimentation and political uncertainty. Ramessid Egypt, power, propaganda, and pressure, the 19th and 20th dynasties, collectively called the Ramessidi period after several kings named Ramesses, represent both the continuation of New Kingdom glory and the beginning of its unraveling. The early Ramesside kings, such as Seti I and Ramesses II, pursued ambitious building and military agendas, while later kings struggled with internal and external challenges. Seti I restored and expanded temples across Egypt, including impressive reliefs at Abydos that depicted his military campaigns and religious devotion. He sought to reassert Egyptian influence in the Levant and to refurbish sacred sites neglected during previous upheavals. Ramesses II, his son, pushed this program even further. He engaged in major campaigns against the Hittites, culminating in the famous Battle of Kadesh. Although the battle did not produce a clear military victor, both sides eventually signed one of the earliest known peace treaties. Ramesses married a Hittite princess as part of the diplomatic settlement, symbolizing a new phase of coexistence between the two great powers. Domestically, Ramesses II's building projects were colossal. Beyond his works at Karnak and Luxor, he built the Ramesseum in Thebes, dedicated large statues of himself in many locations, and commissioned the rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in Nubia. These monuments broadcast his image as a larger-than-life king whose influence extended from the Delta to deep Nubia. However, these achievements came with costs. The resources poured into war and monuments, combined with changing international trade patterns, environmental factors, and internal administrative issues, strained the state. Later Ramesside kings, while still using majestic titles and imagery, presided over a kingdom facing mounting pressures it could not fully control. Society and daily life in the New Kingdom. Behind the grand narratives of kings and battles, millions of Egyptians lived ordinary lives shaped by the rhythms of the Nile and the demands of the state. The New Kingdom economy remained primarily agrarian. Farmers grew grain, vegetables, flax, and other crops, paid taxes in kind, and sometimes served corvée labor on state projects or military campaigns. Specialized communities like Deir al-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders near Thebes, offer a particularly vivid glimpse of daily life. The inhabitants, craftsmen, and their families were relatively privileged, receiving rations of grain, beer, and other goods from the state. They left behind letters, accounts, and even records of a strike when supplies were delayed. These documents reveal concerns about pay, family disputes, health, and devotion to gods and deceased relatives. Women in the New Kingdom enjoyed certain legal rights, including the ability to own property, initiate divorce, and engage in business transactions, though their opportunities varied by class and context. Children learned trades from their parents, and some boys were trained as scribes, opening doors to administrative careers. Religious festivals, local markets, and seasonal work structured the year, providing both obligations and moments of joy. Religion in the afterlife, the Valley of the Kings. New Kingdom concepts of the afterlife crystallized in the decoration and texts of royal and elite tombs. Kings, instead of building pyramids, were buried in rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings near Thebes. These tombs, hidden in desert hills, were lavishly decorated with scenes and texts from collections like the Am-Dawat, the Book of Gates, and later the Book of the Dead. These compositions mapped the sun's nightly journey through the underworld, describing gates, guardians, and challenges that the deceased king had to navigate to be reborn with the sun at dawn. The walls, ceilings, and sarcophagi turned the tomb into a symbolic universe filled with deities, protective spells, and scenes of judgment and transformation. Non-royal individuals adopted shorter or adapted versions of these texts inscribed on papyri placed in coffins on shrouds or on tomb walls. The famous weighing of the heart scene, where the heart of the deceased is balanced against the feather of Mot in the presence of Osiris, encapsulates New Kingdom ethics. A person's actions in life had consequences beyond death, and truthfulness, justice, and piety were essential for a favorable judgment. The decline of the New Kingdom. By the late 20th dynasty, Egypt's imperial structure was faltering. Several interrelated factors contributed to this decline. External pressures, invasions and migrations often associated with groups like the Sea Peoples, disrupted trade and threatened coastal and delta regions. Egypt fought off some of these attackers but could not maintain its previous dominance in the Levant. Economic strain. The costs of defense, monumental building, and maintaining large temples and estates disproportionately burdened the state in an era of shrinking revenue. Internal fragmentation. Powerful priesthoods, especially that of Amen at Thebes, controlled vast resources and wielded significant political influence. In some periods, the high priest of Amen was almost as powerful as the king, creating tensions between temple and throne. Succession issues and corruption, short reigns, intrigues at court, and administrative corruption eroded confidence in central authority. The last Ramesside kings struggled to manage these challenges. Tomb robbery became widespread, reflecting both economic desperation and the breakdown of norms that had protected royal and elite burials. Eventually, Egypt entered another phase of divided rule known as the Third Intermediate Period, in which Libyan dynasties, Theban priest kings, and later Nubian rulers would vie for control. The legacy of the Second Intermediate Period in New Kingdom. Despite its eventual decline, the New Kingdom left a towering legacy. It created Egypt's largest territorial empire and integrated the Nile Valley into a broader network of Near Eastern powers. It elevated Amen and Thebes to the center of religious and political life, reshaping Egyptian theology in ways that would endure even under foreign rule. It produced monumental architecture and art from Karnak to Abu Simbel that continue to define global images of ancient Egypt. It generated rich textile traditions, royal inscriptions, battle records, religious compositions, and personal documents that allow us to reconstruct both high politics and everyday life. The Second Intermediate Period, for its part, contributed key technologies, ideas, and experiences, foreign rule, chariot warfare, new diplomatic realities that the New Kingdom absorbed and transformed. Together, these periods represent a dramatic arc from fragmentation to empire and back toward fragmentation again, illustrating both the strengths and limits of Egypt's political and cultural systems. Next, we will be exploring late period, Persian rule, and Alexander the Great, and from Alexander to the early Ptolemies, joined by our resident Egyptian expert. Join us next time on Blend History with Josh Berry.